In September 2015, Toby Fox released Undertale.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome to Undertale.
The player is dropped into an unfamiliar world, welcomed by a smiling flower.
Oh my god! Die. Jesus Christ, that's fucking
That's
terrible.
out for their blood, only to be saved last minute by Toriel, the gentle caretaker of the ruins. She shows the player how to navigate this world with kindness and understanding, but once the player leaves her care, they're faced with a choice. Do they fight or spare? Sometimes the player slips. Maybe they killed Toriel by accident. But it's fine, right? You can always reset it. It's a game after all. Except... Undertale remembers. That's the obstacle. Nothing is truly erased. The game keeps a record. The world remembers. And some characters, even after a reset, are plagued with the ability to never forget. The other charm to Undertale is the amount of power the player holds in this vast story game. The player shapes the story. Undertale has over 93 endings, but they all fall under 3 major endings: neutral, pacifist, and genocide. The neutral path is unpredictable, a mix of mercy and violence. The player leaves the underground, saving themselves after 2 big boss fights, and a skeleton calls them to explain what came after the player's departure. On the other side, the pacifist path rewards compassion. Frisk spares everyone, removes the chains of the underworld, and liberates the monsters, bringing peace to both worlds. But however, the genocide path...
Whoa! What? One shot? You really hate me that much? You really
Killer one hit!
hate me that much?
Jesus Christ! Okay, so
How did I one shot?
I didn't know what to do with the genocide.
The player can choose destruction, killing every monster, erasing all hope. But in the end, after defeating Sans, the easiest enemy in the game, the player doesn't win. They face Kara, a monster born from the player's own actions, just for the player to be ironically slayed by Kara in the ending. Even after a reset, the game remembers, because in Undertale, the player's actions always leave a mark. That's what made Undertale special. It stood out amongst all the other RPG games in 2015. Now it's 2017. 2 years later, Toby Fox releases a survey program on his Twitter.
Alright, so there's been some kind of a Halloween event for, I guess, Undertale, so...
To everyone's shock, it's a new game.
Looks like he's right. It actually didn't like the program. Well, then I'm gonna have to tell it to do it anyway.
You accept everything that will happen from now on.
Players can create a vessel now, and then give it certain characteristics.
Will now be discarded. No one can choose who they are in this world. Your name is...
However, the player wakes up as Chris. Everything we establish in Undertale is thrown out the window. This isn't the character the player created. The player's choices meant nothing. They're not writing the story anymore, just watching it unfold. The world is familiar, but off. The magical monsters from Undertale, now they're just regular people. Toriel is a tired school teacher. Sans runs a convenience store. They're lighteners, ordinary folks in the surface world. But Chris soon is thrown into the dark world with his companion Susie. a colorful realm beneath reality, full of life, danger, and darkness. Magical beings the player can fight or spare. Rouse, the Prince of the Dark World, tells Chris and Susie the tale of Deltarune. He joins as a loyal ally, soft-spoken, and guiding Chris in their effort to save the Dark World. But unlike Undertale, in Deltarune, the player's choices are hollow. Mercy or violence, same result. The game pushes forward, no matter what the player does. Until Chapter 2.
What? No. 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 Toby?
Those harsh rules of Deltarune get broken. The player finds a crack in the system. A moment where Chris is left alone with Noelle, a shy childhood friend new to the Dark World. She's scared and non-violent in this world, but however the player finds a way to exploit her power. They force her to use a special ability called Ice Shock, an attack that doesn't knock out the enemies, but freezes them solid, presumably dead. As Noelle grows stronger, she unlocks a forbidden spell, Snowgrave. She doesn't know how to cast it, but the player keeps pushing. Eventually she obeys, and casts it on her own friend, Birdly. Afterwards, when Chris exits the Dark World, Birdly becomes unresponsive. No one asks questions. Noelle just shrugs it off, and they move along. The player managed to bend Deltarune's rules. An alternative ending was created, called the Weird Route. This never meant to exist. Now it does. Not because the game allowed it, but because the player forced it. That was the Deltarune cliffhanger and what the community was left with in Chapter 2. Now with Chapter 3 announced, new answers might finally emerge. But before that, something was uncovered deep in the game files. Some changes happened after the Chapter 3 announcement. VeilLane recorded something never meant to be seen by the public. Let's investigate this and see what's it about. Our first video gives us a familiar start. This is the part where Chris was imprisoned by the Darkeners, later freed by Susie. Looks like this is where the familiarity ends. The player takes a path to a mysterious character that didn't exist before. This is the first video regarding these mysterious files, and we got a lot to unpack here from the start. Let's first focus on this poor, starving, unused character. If we were to increase the brightness, we get to notice that this creature looks familiar to one of the Gastro followers from Undertale. But rather it being colored gray, it's colored red. This could also be Toby Fox's unused character sprites, but we can't exactly know. However, regarding its dialogue, it's pretty interesting in the end. Just the way this creature talks in the end is familiar to Jevil. For those that don't know, Jevil is an optional boss in Deltarune. His whole view of the world got turned around after he had a cryptid encounter with a mysterious individual. The interesting thing to Jevil is he's able to foreshadow the player of upcoming events, and one of his dialogues is that rather he's the free one in his prison, while the outside world is the prison, similar to a red creature. However, the red monster's dialogue conveys these topics in a different way. The more Chris interacts with the monster, the more it realizes its own situation, unlike how Jevil is hysteric in this type of situation. Hopefully the red monster finds out what a lawyer is. And finally, the last and most mysterious thing we can notice is for a split frame, we see a shadow Chris. And this is the overworld character Chris, or when he's not in the dark world. What's it doing here? This seems to be intended for Chapter 2, judging by Susie's sprite and the cake dialogue. But in the rooms section, rather than a boarded up stairway to Rousey's room, it's a dark room obstructed by a velvet rope. We are presented with a vast hole and distorted screaming. The abyss is foreshadowing Chris's psyche, where he has that constant pain about his missing brother. He can't come to the terms with it, that his brother is gone. Chris would chew himself out before he came to the realization with the harsh truth. This is why if Chris were to fall into the abyss, he would suffocate first. That's the whole analogy to it. One of the popular theories in Deltarune is that the Dark World is a figment of Chris's imagination, and that Rousey is created as a filler to the void of Chris's missing brother. That is possibly why in this section, Susie is confused on what Rousey is yelling about. She probably can't even see the things Chris is seeing. But however, another interesting thing is before Rousey cuts off Chris, the last word in the dialogue said him. This could have two meanings. The first meaning is it's referencing to Chris's brother, and the second could be W.D. Gaster. Deltarune has a lot of motifs around this cryptid character, and in the community, him is usually referred to as Gaster. For example, the opening song to Chapter 1 is called Another Hymn, which opens up a lot of doors to speculation. This video starts off ominously upbeat. It has confusing misplaced text where it shouldn't be, and a constant ticking from the clock. A working clock in this level is unusual to say, since in the base game the clock is still. What we can also understand that this text was meant to be used in a different level. Ash mentions this in the description, that somehow it was accidentally misplaced. The ending is creepy as it is. Noelle just having the same stare animation, constantly reiterating the same words, and when Noelle says her last dialogue, Ash just backs away from the table and they quit the game. It seems the last dialogue reminded Ash of something. Caddy doubting Susie's help in the project seems to be a reference to Chapter 1, where everyone got assigned a school project, and Chris was the only one left without a project buddy. So he was left with no other choice than Susie. However, the conversation with Caddy is very odd on the way she conversates with Chris, almost as if they're testing the player's decision making. We get reminded of the passage of time again. It seems the clock, or time itself, is a big motif in these videos. Weird how Chris has a second call option as well, being able to call Susie, which is not in the base game. However, instead he tried calling home, and it didn't work. Afterwards, Chris suddenly diagonally walks before the footage cuts. That is very strange. Chris is in the void for a split second. It seems it's a returning motif of dark voids. He's still not allowed to call home for some reason as well. He can only call Susie. There it is. We see another dark void for a split second. This time when the player hovers over home. Very strange. Did you notice that? If we look back, the player instantly clicks call home and manages to brute force it. The last Susie dialogue repeats, but as a result, seconds later, Chris is put in a dark void without any colors on his sprite. The player is not alone. I believe the dialogue regarding the sea is a metaphor for the Dark World. Chris is a troubled teen in the lore, and going to the Dark World is their form of escapism from this dull, light world. That's why the first half of the dialogue goes on about Chris's hometown. I also think that this is not Susie talking on the last dialogue. One thing that confirms this is the sprite. For a split second, it doesn't load at the start, and it's weirdly in a third-person perspective. Just the way this dialogue is not in character on how Susie talks. This could be that dark figure that approached Chris. Is the Dark Void communicating with Chris, luring him to jump in? It would make sense if he were to jump in the water. He'd die suffocating before reaching the bottom, since that's how the water works. That's what the dialogue said in Castletown. But these are my thoughts for the second half of the dialogue. The void is heavily referenced in this video again. This solidifies my claims for this being a very cryptid and off-place video. Possibly the void will become a very strong motif as we go down. Well guys, it isn't Deltarune if there aren't any quirky jokes. I can kinda relate to this character. Marketing is pretty stressful here and there. Oddly, in the description, Ash mentions that these characters would have been in the forest level of Deltarune, which is kinda odd. Lastly, the dark figure appears again, but this time it looks like a darkened sprite of Overworld Chris again. What could they be doing here? In the original Deltarune, we never get to know the reason why Asriel isn't around anymore. But however, in this alternative Deltarune, we may have gotten a hint of what might have happened. While the dialogue is going, we hear waves in the background. We are reminded with the ocean again. This is a very strong motif in the videos. It may also be a little nudge to the 05 Susie phone dialogue as well. This probably explains us why Chris is obsessed with the ocean. He has a very uneasy mind after Asriel disappeared, and possibly Chris is constantly haunted by his own shadows and reminded of Asriel. What's interesting about this version of the boat ride level is that it's very scenic and doesn't have the battery acid lake. Rather, it's just regular water, reminding us of the motif associated with the ocean. It's interesting that we have 4 dialogue options in this version, rather than the 2. And one very weird thing about the dialogue is that the player skips on the you question. You could be referring to Chris or Rousey. We cannot exactly know. Either way, another possible indication of Chris and his relation with his brother. The reason I believe this is since one of the more widely accepted theories in Deltarune is that Rousey is a parody of Chris's brother. Since the base game we get an indication that the Dark World is an imaginary world. made by Chris, thus hinting to the fact that Rousey is made as a form of coping on his missing brother. Speaking of Rousey, if we compare the way Rousey talks in the original level and this level, he's more upfront with his thoughts, directly divulging his opinions, rather than being soft-spoken, which is an interesting change to Rousey's personality, to say. Chris isn't allowed to call home again. And for the final frame of the video, Chris is further into the water. This video uses the same motifs from the previous ones, solidifying their importance in the storyline. Other than that, nothing too much to say, but it's pretty wholesome that Noelle and Susie are talking on the same phone. This may have been cut chapter 3 dialogue, who knows. This video is really interesting. I think this one is a connection with the 07 Cyberfield TV room. It seems it's a recreation what was explained to us in the Cyberfield TV. Rousey's attitude again is very different than the base game, where he's demanding for Chris's attention, as well as talking in a very weird way. I think the reason Rousey has the Chapter 1 outfit is because the game probably doesn't want to remind us of Asriel, but rather have some type of thing that kinda conveys his voice. This is possibly the hole in Chris's mind that was referenced to, the ocean. He decided to jump in it and go deeper, drowning himself. Chris may as well be the drowned kid in this story. while Rousey, or Asriel to say, was watching the sunset while it happened. Water in Deltarune is constantly referenced as a source of power as well. For example, for both chapters, you need to cut off a flowing stream to end the Dark World. This could also be a symbolic meaning that Chris is so disconnected from his lost brother that he is losing himself in the Dark World, potentially being eaten up by the Dark World. It looks like Chris's favorite pastime manifested into a big monster that he cannot overcome. And that is the second half of the video's symbolism. The water fountain dialogue reminds us of Chris's aquaphobia, possibly from the events of the previous videos. What's really strange about this video is the alternative school that Chris is in, and as well as Toriel is moving away from the town, which in the base game itself this isn't indicated or mentioned anywhere. This could have two meanings. If we go by the base game Deltarune narrative, this could be the school level before the happenings of Chapter 1, since in Chapter 1 it's already established that Toriel and Asgore are divorced. But however, if we're going off the alternative story in this unreleased Deltarune, then after the beach incident, something made Toriel want to move out. Notice how the player avoids interacting with the painting that has a beach. This time the clock isn't ticking, indicating that time is still. Chris is possibly in some type of limbo, not being able to go to the dark world anymore. The items inside the closet, some of them match the description of characters we saw. For example, a blue quill is a nod to Birdly. And of course the obvious, the pale purple skin is Susie. And when the dialogue ends, the player checks their phone. This is probably telling us that the player acquired Susie's phone number. But however, rather than the player calling Susie, they attempted to call home again. They were unable to. Last thing I can say about this is we might be getting the idea now why the player can't call home. And I think it's tied with the dialogue about Toriel moving out. Additionally, we never get to see Toriel in the videos so far. Guess Toriel really is gone. Hey, what's up guys? This is a bit off script here, but I want to make a little break in the video really quickly. I want to appreciate you all for loving the content I make. Recently, I have reached 1.5k subscribers and the channel is still growing. And honestly, that's just a big motivation for me to keep this channel going. Just the amount of likes and views that these videos are getting just tells me that you guys are liking this content. Also, personally, I am a big fan of Undertale / Deltarune, so since I enjoy the genre so much, I possibly might do a stream of the new Deltarune chapters. So be on the lookout for that. Other than that, thanks a lot guys, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and a subscribe, it really means a lot. This video is really interesting in its subtlety. Let me show you what I mean by that. If you have noticed guys, in this version, the Sans song just doesn't have Sans in it. In fact, Sans has been missing for all of the videos so far. We haven't gotten any indication of Sans. Even in this level, all the stuff that is associated with Sans is just replaced. And we are just left with Papyrus constantly saying that he loves you. Is this implying something happened with Sans? Something really sinister happened? And this was Papyrus's last words before the sinister thing happened? This is really strange. Also, the flavor text is awfully discouraging, even calling the player a moron for not reading the sign. However, for the TV dialogue, I think it's a reference to the previous video, the 07 Cyberfield TV room, reminding us of what happened on the TV. Last weird thing I can point out is why the flavor text says, "not this one." Is Chris not meant to use this certain dimensional door, the note that explained the rules of the TDDs just disappears after Chris finishes reading it. Did Chris possibly take this note to use it elsewhere? Finally, it's very weird how the note is not in ye old English. That's usually how Rules card talks. It's very out of his character, almost as if this is so serious that Rules had to break out of his character. The description of this video says it's so beautiful. I think Ash is hinting to us that the missing text in this is connected with 03_misplaced text. What a coincidence that the 13th video is connected with the third one. We can kinda understand now why Noelle had that creepy expression. Her dialogue was meant for the brooch. She was gazing upon this brooch that she just didn't have any other words to say. But one inconsistency with 03 being connected to this is the end part of the dialogue. If it was connected, why do we have that dialogue instead of another text_string_J shop? I think this video is a red herring. Noelle has made appearances in these videos, but you know who else hasn't so far? Toriel. If I were to reiterate the final dialogue, she took Chris as her own. She has done so much for him. However, she's gone now. Chris doesn't know where she is. Every time he calls home, he can't. And when he does call home, he is left all alone in the void, like the way he was left now. This may be the case of the game somehow changing itself. This level was meant to be for Noelle, but something hijacked it and changed it at the end. Probably why at 03 the text was "accidentally misplaced," end of quotation marks. There it is, the thing I was talking about earlier. Toriel's sprite is replaced with an X. Now this could be a placeholder, but I think in reality it's reminding us that Toriel is not meant to be shown in these videos. That she is truly gone. For me to explain what's going on here, I'd have to lightly summarize a popular theory in the Deltarune fandom. And that theory is the Dead Chris theory. This theory surfaced after players defeated the secret boss, Jevil, in Chapter 1. After defeating him, they would obtain a mysterious item, in their inventory called the Shadow Crystal. This item would have mysterious properties. For example, when the player uses it in the dark world, it would give a glimpse how the levels look like in the light world, indicating that the dark world is an imaginary place or some type of illusion. This shows off the fourth wall breaking powers of the Shadow Crystal. But however, if the player decides to use it in the light world, it gives these two cryptid dialogues. The crystal saying that Chris can see through his hands might be a bad omen, and it could be an indicator that Chris might be a walking dead man, or that he is to die soon in the later chapters. If we were to look at the symbolism in this video, no power and the broken radiator means Chris is knocked out cold with no body heat, and his corpse might be eaten by moths, rotting away like unwashed sheets. The house is a symbolism of Chris's body in this video, and smashed windows means the soul has left his body. If we read into the description, it mentions that this video was made after Chapter 1 was released. The X dialogue at the start says Chapter 2 open cutscene. This possibly was an alternative cutscene for Chapter 2, where it would have alluded to the fact that Chris is dead, or to the dead Chris theory. This is probably why the text at the end is telling Chris he needs to find a way out. It could mean that his body is fading away. He needs to find his soul before he becomes nothing. Probably why he also grabbed the dimensional door instructions. He might be buying some time before he fully fades away. Chris disobeyed Card's instructions, and as a result, he's now in a surreal, kaleidoscopic dimension. The overwhelming burst of colors instantly reminds me of those near-death hospital stories, where patients describe seeing vivid, otherworldly, colorful lights right before being shocked back to life by a defibrillator. what we can understand from the monologue is that it's a reference to one of the pivotal points in the Undertale pacifist ending, and that's calling for help. Frisk getting all his friends and teaming up to defeat the thing that is keeping the monsters locked up. But it seems that in this Deltarune, Chris is in no position to call for help, or simply he doesn't want help. He finally manages to call home, however, but he isn't greeted with a warm welcome. Rather than his brother Asriel scolding him, we can kinda piece the story together now and get a more clear understanding why Chris at 10_lake decided to just swim away from Asriel, aka Rousey. He didn't feel good enough to be around Asriel. That's the story I'm understanding right now. The Rousey dialogue in 10_lake makes sense now as well. Asriel was fed up with Chris over imaginary things. All these Dark World shenanigans probably seemed as nonsense for Asriel. And he probably was on the mindset, why can't his brother get less weirder type of mentality. And from speculation, we can kind of speculate when that drowning happened. The drowning was so bad that it made Toriel be ashamed of everything, leaving the house and being gone forever, never to be seen again. Also, final note, did anybody notice how the last sentence of the monologue is the exact same what the red figure says in the first video? Is possibly Asriel that red figure we saw behind the bars? Or is it just another case of text being accidentally misplaced? The mysterious double doors at the forest have released horrors beyond our imagination. This is how the roaring would play out. Angels with colors in the sky. The city is descending into chaos to the point where the monster government isn't welcoming humans anymore. Haunting trees outgrowing the city, and monsters returning back to their old ways of terror. I have never seen Alphys be portrayed in such a terrifying way, and same goes for all the other wholesome monsters in Deltarune. In this level, you can get that sense of panic, that weirdness of what's going on, since how could such an innocent city go down to this dark reality so fast? It's almost as if it's a weird route of Deltarune. The roaring took the light from the lighteners, and now they are left with their own insanity, possibly why they are grayed out as well. We get a reminder of the dark abyss again, since at the hospital the only remaining letters is pit. Could this be implying this is what the void is like if Chris were to jump inside of that dark abyss? Another interesting thing is Sans' shop. It doesn't even have any letters. Matter of fact, Sans still just doesn't exist. Again, any instance of his existence is replaced with something else. Like, the game doesn't want us to know that Sans exists, which is kind of weird. And also, the lake has flooded the town. But while we were distracted by the lake, I noticed one odd detail. The player never enters Asgore Flower Shop. And on the right side of Asgore's flower shop, is that blood in his basement? I'm sure those aren't any stray pixels. In the base game itself, this little mysterious basement has some theories around the connection between Sans and Asgore, so we could only horrifyingly wonder what could have happened in that basement. Then after Chris has his encounter with the most creepiest form of Noel, he goes up to his house, and the house is just missing, and the music stops. Chris is left in this terrifying purgatory copy of his own town, without a home of his own. One explanation I can give to the house missing is that Sans and Toriel just packed their bags and left after it escalated to this insanity. They probably knew the roaring was about to come soon. However, if we go back to rules cards, rules on the TDDs, one of the rules is that you can carry maximum 3 individuals at once. Does this mean that Sans possibly left Asgore behind? Is that why there's blood leaking outside of his basement? Since logically the third person Sans would bring is Papyrus. That does open a lot of doors to speculation. Chris doesn't have a home anymore, so the only thing left he can do is call Susie. This fits one of the dialogues of the Shadow Crystals, describing to us how Susie would have a cold expression on herself. Is the reason Susie sharing the same memories as Chris a result of entering the TDD in 15_doorway? Since in the video, Chris, Susie, and Rouse enter it, but they are not seen on the other end of it. Possibly they got moved to a different spot after the encounter. Lastly, for the ending, the fog pauses, almost like the whole game is brought to a stop, and Susie tries to awake Chris from this awful dream, but I don't think Chris is able to wake from his purgatory. I remember one interesting thing about Deltarune is when Chapter 2 came out and people started data mining it, they found out that there's a listing for Chapter 0 in the game code. Is this level meant to be Chapter 0, like a before chapter of what everything happened? If so, we get to see how Azrael acts around Chris. It's interesting how this video flips the dynamic between characters again. Back in Undertale, Kara, the adopted human, was cold and dismissive towards Azrael, treating him more like a burden than a brother. But in this alternative Deltarune, that dynamic seems to have been reversed. Azrael is the one who's distant from Chris. Now, I'm not implying that Chris is Chara, since that's a whole different theory in the Deltarune fandom, but the key takeaway here is we get to see the brother dynamic between Chris and Azrael, or that Azrael was not accepting at all towards Chris. Then afterwards, Chris walks through an endless hallway of mirrors. Symbolically, it feels like he's been avoiding his own reflection, or to say avoiding himself during these days with Azrael. But on the third mirror, he finally looks, and that moment might have been the turning point, possibly when Chris looked at himself and decided to do something. Chris is seen waltzing through a maze inside a broken house, slowly losing himself in endless hallways. All Chris ever wanted was a place to call home, but however the phone hangs unanswered. The house is gone, and everyone Chris knew is gone too. As Chris wanders, he tries to hold onto those memories of a family, of a life that he lost. That's why he stumbles into a different version of himself, the normal Chris from the regular Deltarune timeline. He gets a glimpse of what could have been a normal life, but the mirror tells him, not this one. This Chris can't be that Chris. He's something else entirely. Chris never had a place to truly call home. Every home he was given, he was ultimately rejected from, even by Azriel. That's part of why Toriel gave up too. She couldn't help Chris fit in, and that's the symbolism behind Chris's connection to the broken house. It's a place for someone who's never belonged. That's why in the end, Chris just keeps walking. He moves on from his past. But by now he may just be a walking dead man, never being able to find what he truly wants. The second to last video is titled Unused Revelation, and we may get our answers to this story we've been speculating so far. Even though Azriel wasn't accepting of Chris, he did do one thing, and that is he kept Chris grounded in reality, preventing him from losing himself further. But now Azriel is gone, and Chris is fully free to jump into the void. Chris couldn't fit in as a human in a monster's world, so he planned to do something about it. Chris lost the only place where he felt safe, the dark world. And when you're desperate, left with nothing, anyone can become a villain under any circumstances. Chris met Susie, someone who became an unlikely ally. Chris manipulated Noelle, breaking down her hesitations until she became the perfect yes man for his plans. Chris created fictional versions of these real monsters. In this fictional setting, the fictional monsters will finally pay attention to him, but in the end, his imagination could only take him so far. He had to intervene to make it feel real. Chris returned to the lake, descending deeper into its anomalous waters. There, he encountered an ancient, powerful creature that is far greater than himself. Tales whispered that this being would kill any human who dared to turn back or break its rules. But Chris was the only human to be there. No one else could make that mistake. And so, without fear, by following the creature's rules, Chris made a deal with the devil. Chris saw his world transform into the fantasy he always longed for. He sold his town to this decaying creature, trading it all away for a dream. But the deal came at a price. Chris became a walking dead man. His time in this fantasy world was limited, locked into an unstoppable fate. And when the clock strikes its last beat, or as it's called, the roaring, Chris's time will end, and as he fades away, everything around him will decay as well. After everything, Chris realized that selling everyone for the sake of his fantasy wasn't worth it. So for the final battle, he won't go down alone. He's taking the creature with him. And after all the speculations, false leads, and whatnot, Chris is finally outside of the house. He is finally free and able to call home. He is no longer held back by the creature which he sold his world to. All the guilt he had is lifted. It's also implied that Toriel has left Chris due to some unfortunate circumstances. Not that something catastrophic may have happened. That was the story of the El Void Deltarune ARG. But before we end the video, let's head into a short analysis on some holes that were left in the story. After understanding the whole story, I think we can pinpoint that Chris being dead was implying that he's carrying all this guilt from selling the town to this godly monster. That's why in the conclusion, Chris isn't actually dead, rather than he's guilt-free after he proved himself to the monster. He proved that this world is worth keeping around and that the monster shouldn't just throw away all these lives. From the ending, we can gather that the creature is Utgard Loki, not to be confused with Loki, Thor's companion. Utgard is a god in Norse mythology known as the Master of Illusions. According to the myths, Utgard presents hidden challenges and contests to Thor and Loki. He gives them trials that seem simple on the surface, but in reality they're layered with tricks and a deeper meaning. After all the challenges, Utgard reveals himself as the one behind the trials, humbling both Thor and Loki in the process. The main takeaway from this mythology is a lesson in pride, how our assumptions blind us, and how being humbled reveals the truth. Guess one red herring I let slip in was the story from Caddy's dad. In reality, he was describing the monsters in the lake. I don't know what to say anymore, but it seems that there's more red herrings than trouts. I'm hoping that the trout population doesn't get damaged by this. Going back to Caddy's dad's story, it's pretty interesting on the human part. It kinda makes sense why Chris is the only human left in this town. If all the other humans died trying to enter the monster as a group, it seems the only way to beat the game was one single brave human full of pride. And that's why Chris got awarded after respecting the monster's rules. But however, that reward came with a price. The symbolism behind this could be conveying that sometimes it is only us individually that can accomplish the things that we want. But everything we strive for, there's always a price for it, no matter how big or small it is, because there are moments where having a whole group of people could cause more issues than solve anything. It kind of reminds me of that age-old saying, if you want something done, do it yourself. One thing I can say about the channel is that it sounds similar to Ash Tree Lane, and since the whole ARG series has connections with House of Leaves and trees as well, it makes sense that the poster is more connected to the story themselves. Possibly Ash and Chris are the same person in this ARG? Well, that's a strong maybe. The description of the channel says, if I stop uploading daily, assume I'm dead. Hopefully nothing bad has happened to Ash. Maybe they're peacefully living in the forest, since that's where Chris walked off to on the last video. Alright guys, for this part I'm just gonna go a little bit of off script, but I think the ARG has a very lovely and unique story. It flips the dynamic of Undertale and Deltarune. It honestly creates this world where everyone hates the main character, but the main character still has to push through even past all that hate and whatnot. Since in Undertale and Deltarune itself, you kind of have this like little support nest between all the characters. Like some like you, some don't like you. But over here, Chris just lands on all the unluckiest places, you know. Toriel left him, Asriel doesn't like him, nobody talks to him. But one thing I can say is the final message of the whole ARG is very simple. Go outside and touch grass. It's easy to lose yourself in the virtual worlds of your own computer, whether if it's games, social platforms, or just your own thoughts. No matter how thrilling those worlds are, there's nothing that can replace real life. The feeling of being alive is just different. Seeing the seasons change in front of your eyes, the joy of meeting new people, the quiet beauty of a sunrise. These things you can truly experience in the real world if you take the time to look into them. And if you feel stuck in a hole, trapped in depression, lost in despair, remember, the answer isn't the end. There's always a way forward, but it takes pride, confidence, and decision to act on that. Since we are the only ones who can steer the direction of our lives, nobody else can tell us which way to go, and ultimately it just becomes our responsibility. So the story of this whole ARG additionally is also about learning to move along. That's my interpretation of the whole ARG.
Night is running low, and the shadows start to